Well, welcome. Welcome to this another stormy Brisbane evening. Hope you didn't get wet getting to the beautiful Brisbane City Hall, which I was saying I've had a long association with, so I hope you enjoy the atmosphere here in what's a great room to have an evening like we're about to have. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which this event's taking place and elders both past and present. My name is Andrew Chesterman and I was absolutely thrilled to get the invitation from Kevin to oversee proceedings this evening to this important event, and I'm really pleased that you've given me the opportunity. Throughout my almost 30-year career in both the public and private sector, I've been both the beneficiary and the promoter of workplaces that promote flexibility in the workplace and foster a mentally healthy workplace culture. I've seen the benefits it brings both to employer and employee, and particularly as employees balance their changing demands of personal and professional life. When I was CEO of the Public Service Commission, I was really proud to have personally initiated the Queensland Government's involvement in the Queensland Male Champions of Change program and what is now its current inclusion and diversity strategy. Flexibility is a key aspect of creating inclusive and diverse workplaces, but there's also an increasing body of evidence to show that these initiatives produce strong business outcomes by positively influencing productivity and employee engagement, reducing the costs of absenteeism and improving general health and wellbeing. Tonight's discussion with our panel here will be informal, perhaps, a bit of a chat with some Q&As at the end, and will be a discussion about how flexible workplaces and a focus on mental health can improve your bottom line. Each of our four panellists will provide their perspective on the topic based on a combination of experience and research and evidence. Following the four presentations, we will invite questions from the audience, and I'd now like to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Kevin Cox. He's a highly respected human rights and disabilities advocate, as many of you will know. Kevin commenced an initial 4-year appointment as Queensland's Anti-Discrimination Commissioner in February 2011. He's been reappointed twice since then and will remain Commissioner until February 2018 when he sees out his final term. He holds a Masters of Social Welfare, Administration and Planning from the University of Queensland. He's received numerous community recognition awards, including an Order of Australia for the promotion of human rights for people with disability in Australia, the Australian Human Rights Medal by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, the Centenary Medal for Distinguished Services to Disability Services in Queensland, and a QUT Award for the Humanities and Human Services Outstanding Alumni Award. This award recognised the contribution he made of exceptional professional achievement and contribution to the community at a local, state, national and international level. Can you please welcome Kevin?
Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the end of our Human Rights Month. Also like to thank my fellow panellists for agreeing to impart their wisdom with us tonight, and looking forward to some critical questions and respectful conversation. I was on a panel not so long ago that probably couldn't be described as respectful. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. A little bit about the Human Rights Month. This is our second year that ADCQ has hosted the Human Rights Month, and I'd just firstly like to thank the team in community engagement for all their work, and particularly their manager, Michaela Jeffries, for the inspirational work that they've imparted upon, and the knowledge and the information they've been able to share with people, and also our other staff from training and corporate services and complaints, who provide a lot of the information or the basis, the stories. also like to acknowledge the traditional owners. And we're here tonight to talk about employer of choice. And for me, in plain terms, the employer of choice means an organisation that is a great place to work. Nothing more, nothing less. But obviously, to make it a great place to work, it requires a lot of effort and a lot of thought. And, given basically we all start from the premise that we're hardwired to discriminate, and a lot of that is about survival. When our forefathers, whose knuckles might have been a little bit closer to the ground than ours today, they had to make decisions whether they would run or be eaten or attack and eat the furry animal over beyond the bushes. And so over time, we developed shortcuts to make those decisions. And science tells us we all hold about 11 million pieces of information in our head at any one time. And that our brains, as big as they are, can only process about 30 or 40 of them at any one time. And therefore, you revert to stereotypes to make those decisions. And that, of course, leads us to conscious, but more particularly unconscious biases. And they are evident in all work cultures. And we are often not aware of our own unconscious bias until it slaps us in the face one day. And if we work and if we don't try to become conscious of our unconscious bias, well then I think as organisations we'll struggle to become an employer of choice. Some argue about, is it the culture or is it leadership? I think that's chicken and egg argument. In my humble opinion, I think it's clearly leadership that creates a culture. The leader sets the standards that the rest of the organisation abide by and work to. What message do you think it sends to your staff when the CEO says to the board, to their board or their minister, I have family responsibilities that requires me to leave work at 3 p.m. 5 days a fortnight? I think it gives permission for an organisation to start a conversation about flexible working arrangements. It creates an opportunity for organisations to talk about how do we create safe spaces to have difficult conversations about what sort of an organisation we want. It empowers individuals from an AO2 to the CEO to have a voice, and for that voice to be heard and respected. Not every idea will get up, of course, but I think if we feel heard and we see some reflection of our ideas somewhere down the track, then we feel valued. And if we feel valued, then we are going to be more productive. We are going to value the people that we are there to serve. And that can be our fellow staff members, or it can be the people, if we have specific service provider roles. Because far too often in our work, we hear about complaints that really diminish the dignity and the humanity of individuals. That should never, ever have occurred if we had robust conversations in our workplaces about how do we value ourselves and how do we value our clients or the people who we are there to serve. And language is so important. because even talking about clients suggests we're talking about a hierarchical structure. And of course, in some businesses, clients might be a very appropriate term to use, such as law firms. But maybe there are other terms that could be talked about in the way you engage your the people who you serve. So, if we talk about flexible working arrangements, if you're a small organisation to a large organisation, there are always going to be challenges to achieve them. But as I said, the important thing is to empower your staff to engage in those conversations, whether they be in teams or departments or as whole agencies, about what are their expectations, what are their aspirations, and what are their work performance expectations, and how they manage to address all of those in a way that delivers their service or product of a high standard and quality. And of course, other speakers will talk more poignantly than I about looking out for each other's well-being. And this, of course, is a reciprocal principle. Not only should your boss look after your well-being, you should also be looking out for your boss's well-being. And of course, we often think about diversity and inclusion. And diversity is often framed in the gender context. But we know diversity has many dimensions. Some of them are visible, like race, age, gender. And other aspects of diversity are less apparent, like disability, sexual orientation, gender expression, and religion. These dimensions of diversity are sometimes the tip of your workforce iceberg. How long have I got? 2 minutes. Okay. So there are many things that make each of us different, and all of these dimensions of diversity are important. But unless we have an inclusive culture which focuses on the values that empower open-mindedness, promote healthy conflict, value new perspectives, and avoid judgmental attitudes, then we will never have true diversity, because we won't attract the people that bring diversity, that are diverse and bring the diversity to our workforces. Given that Australia is one of the largest and most successful multicultural countries, we have to ask ourselves the question, does our workforce look like the people in the Queen Street Mall today or tonight? A little brief history about the mall. When it was first built, it was purely a business-based enterprise, and there were a lot of violence in the mall. And when a wise consultant came and said we need to make it an economic and a social spaces, then we have the mall that we have today, which is inclusive of everybody and of difference. So in closing, inclusion is not about bringing people into what already exists. It is making a new space, a better space for everyone. That's according to George Day. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Kevin. I'd now like to introduce Tony Stevenson. Tony's given 25 interviews today, I think, and so this will be a 26th speech. He's been doing a number of radio interviews, so if his voice fails, we might get him a glass of water. Tony's the former CEO of Mental Illness Fellowship Queensland and recently appointed National CEO of Mental Illness Fellowship of Australia. For more than 30 years, Tony's been committed to supporting viable and proactive health and community services which work alongside families and individuals to inspire self-confidence and hope. His passion for reform that improves the mental health and well-being of Australians complements an impressive portfolio of enterprise and expertise spanning a range of social inclusion and social justice priorities, including homelessness, child protection, child development and family support, substance abuse, disability services, ageing and domestic violence. As a strong advocate for reform, Tony's contributed to many government and non-profit forums, panels and committees helping drive policy development and program delivery. He's been a board director of QCOS and Families Australia, the principal consultant for the COAG reform of children's services in Australia, a subcommittee chair of the Australian Health and Community Services Ministerial Council and director of the Queensland Government's Institutional Reform Secretariat. Tony believes in the intrinsic value of humanity and the right for everyone to live the life of their choice in the community. Please welcome Tony.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks, Kevin, for the opportunity and the invitation to join in the panel tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners. Talking about an employer of choice, I think the reality is for most people living with mental illness, any employer will probably do. The reality is that 80% of people experiencing mental illness are unemployed. Staggering figure. And that's why this week, this month, World Human Rights Day on Saturday, we're advocating for an end to the discrimination that exists, mostly through ignorance, that prevents people experiencing mental illness to live a productive life and to work and contribute to their community. So some recent statistics are that around 80% of people don't believe that a person with mental illness can hold down a job. 60% of employers in the UK recently said that they wouldn't employ a person with mental illness. I think one of the issues is that we talk about mental illness, we talk about mental health, we talk about mental well-being. What exactly are we talking about? It's a very big continuum of normal human experiences that many or all of us will experience. And many of us will experience, more times when we require support around our mental health. And for some people, there's a very serious experience of mental illness throughout their whole life. But the fact is that wherever people are along that continuum, there is a very good chance, or even a certainty, of a person's capacity to work well and to contribute to be a loyal and productive employee. From the statistics that we do know about and the recent studies, the cost of mental ill health in the workplace in Australia is $11 billion a year. And there's a significant return on that, on any investment that employers make to improve the situation in their workplace that will encourage people to be able to talk about their mental health, for employers to make the adjustments that are necessary, and for people to continue to work, to take the time they need to recover when they're not well, and then return to the workplace. So that's $11 billion cost to the economy. And in fact, the Herald Lateral Economics Index, which many believe is a much better measure of our national welfare than our traditional economic data. So that's now recording a $40 billion increase in a decade, and that's a measure of the cost to our collective well-being caused by mental illness in our community. So not only is it a huge social issue, it's an issue for employers in lost productivity, but it's also an incredible drain on our social cohesion as well. I'm absolutely confident that everyone in this room tonight is an employer of choice. But what does that mean for you as employers, as people dedicated to your organisation? There are three things which I think we can all look at closely. Supporting our own employees' mental health and well-being, understanding the people that our organisation works with. Anyone in a customer service environment working with the public is going to work with many people across our diversity, many of whom will have issues around mental health. How do our employees understand the people that they're working with so that they can better relate to people, understand how to support people, whether they're a bus driver, a bank teller, or whatever. And thirdly, for organisations whose core business is to work with people, many of whom have significant mental health issues. So your own employees, your customers, and the people that you are supporting. We can all learn more about mental health in our workplace and how to improve in each of those areas. So we spend an enormous amount of time at work. For all of us, I guess, we can experience many environmental factors, organisational factors, stress, lifestyle choices, the daily hassles that impact on our health and well-being. All of these things are happening within our workplace. As well as that, we've got people who are in our workforce with existing mental health issues. Are they well? Are they experiencing times of not being so well? Are they coming to work but not really present? These are the sorts of issues that we can be more aware of in our workplace. Open up the conversations, as Kevin said. MIFA organisations around the country, and there are 11 organisations in our network, have worked over the last 30 years supporting people mostly experiencing severe mental illness. Each year we support 30,000 people, and we're connected to another 30,000 people through our information and helplines and resources. More than half the people in our organisation have a lived experience. That's evidence enough of the capacity to work and hold down a job. The other people that we work with have been disadvantaged and excluded from all aspects of life, whether it's a decent place to live, perhaps they've spent long times in hospital, times in prison, they've been separated from their families. Strategies are available to assist people however they experience their mental illness, that can assist people to recover, and certainly to assist people to recover well enough to work and to maintain work. So I guess this is some of the key strategies that we can adopt in our workplace. Kevin's already talked about many of these. To understand about mental illness, there are so many myths there. I think we rely a lot on the media, on popular culture, on movies. We still have very much, I think, a 19th century understanding of severe mental illness. When words like schizophrenia or psychosis are used, how do we understand that and the experiences that people have? Dispelling the myths is the first part of understanding how we can be an employer of choice. and maintain employment for people with mental illness. Opening up the spaces, those important spaces that Kevin talked about, which enable conversations to take place. Mental illness is just another health issue. People in our workplaces experience a whole range of health issues. Certainly, many people in our workplaces would experience mental health issues when you consider the number of people in the population that have those experiences throughout their lifetime. It's another health issue. How do we open up the conversation so that people feel safe to talk about their own experiences? Most people in the workplace who do experience a form of mental illness are fearful of disclosing it. Certainly fearful of disclosing that at the recruitment process, and unless they develop the trust and the confidence within their team and with their manager, they're very unlikely to disclose that. If something happens which might affect a person's capacity to come into work, to be productive, perhaps they're using more leave than most others, without disclosing the underlying issues, then things escalate very quickly from there. We all need to know what's happening. If it's not an understanding of a person's mental health issues, then perhaps it's an issue around their productivity. And once we head down that path, there's often no turning back. Psychological injury is the second biggest form of injury in the workplace, but it's far more costly. And if a person doesn't return to work after about 6 months, there's very little likelihood of ever returning back into work. That's why it's important to be able to respond to these issues quickly and to develop that environment where everyone in the workplace feels safe about talking about the issues. And of course, most importantly, to understand the reasonable adjustments that people need, the flexibility, time off. It's just about recovery, and we understand that from many other health issues. There is a time for recovery, and then for most people, they're back at work. I might share a couple of examples from MIFQ and MIFQ in particular, about how they've gone about addressing the health and well-being within their own organisation. Over the last 12 months, everyone in the organisation has participated in a program called Reflect and Connect. I think most organisations are going through incredible change at the moment. MIFQ is certainly one of those. Other organisations here that might be working in the disability or mental health space will certainly understand the change that's happening. It was important to bring everyone together, to talk about their fears, their anxieties, and to develop the trust and the confidence to feel that they were able to take on these challenges and changes, and to invite people to contribute the things that are important to them into the workplace. It's programs like that that open up conversations, that enable people to find a space to talk about the things that are important to them. Yeah, okay. You may have noticed some information about Intuitus. That's also a program initiated by MIFQ. After the 30 years of experience working with people with significant mental health issues in the community, MIFQ is now able to offer that to employers, to assist employers to understand those myths around mental health, to open up those conversations, to help managers understand how they can have those conversations as well, and to look for ways in which reasonable adjustments can be accommodated into an organisation's policies. And just in closing, we need to be able to measure what it is that we're doing. There are a number of ways in which we can measure our effectiveness, and that's also something I'm sure Paul is able to assist with as well, and MIFQ, to be able to understand if we're effective in these processes, to see whether there has been a change in people's stress levels generally in the organisation, to measure aspects of absenteeism and presenteeism, to understand whether the programs that we're implementing are actually working. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. I'd now like to introduce Professor Paula Brough. Paula is a Professor of Organisational Psychology in the School of Applied Psychology at Griffith University and the leader of the Healthy Workplaces Research Group within the Menzies Health Institute, Queensland. Professor Brough's research focuses on three primary areas: enhancing employee mental health and wellbeing, reducing experiences of occupational stress within high-risk industries such as police, corrections and fire services, and assessing both practical and theoretical components of work-life balance and related constructs. Please welcome Professor Brough.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Kevin, for inviting me here today. So I'm taking a little bit of a different perspective. I'm a university researcher, so I'm based up in the ivory tower, not so much in the real world, but my research is all applied. So it's about working with organisations, focusing on employee mental health to try and improve mental health and well-being across a number of areas. And one of the main areas I've been researching for the last few years is around work-life balance and the impact of work-life imbalance for employees and for employers. So I thought today I would just, because we've only got a few minutes, so I thought I'd quickly go through the key changes I've seen in the last few years in this area. A couple of points where change is more limited, and then I'll try and wrap it all up so it makes some sense. And I haven't got lots of slides, so the students who are in the audience who I've previously taught, I recognise a few faces, don't have to worry, it's not going to be one of those boring lectures. Okay, so the key changes we've seen in the last 15 years or so that we've been researching in this area are generally positive. So we've seen an increased recognition that effective work-life balance policies or flexible workplace practices, whatever you want to call them, that they make economic sense for organisations. And that's great. So in the early days, way back when we were all a lot younger, work-life balance policies were seen as a sort of an add-on, a fluffy add-on that didn't actually contribute to the overall economic growth of an organisation. So it's fantastic to see organisations standing up and putting a dollar value and saying, when we have introduced effective work-life balance policies, we've actually seen a return on investment. And that's fantastic to see that. It's great that work-life balance policies, flexible workplace practices have increased their scope. So again, way back in the early days, they were generally a women's issue, women with young children's issue that was sort of sidelined somewhat. It's great to see that work-life balance policies now obviously are focused on men as well, paternal leave as well as maternal leave, but also include other dependents other than young children. So people can get leave for a whole range of issues, including elder care, looking after other relatives, but also for sporting or religious or study purposes. So I think that's a positive aspect that work-life balance policies have broadened. And in fact, from the research we do, we find that workers who want work-life balance policies often don't have dependents at all. So it's about equal numbers of workers who want flexibility in their workplace to improve their levels of mental health and to improve their work performance, regardless of whether they have dependents or not. It's great that Australia has joined All but one of the OECD countries now has statutory paid parental leave, although I know there's lots of debates about that still, but that's fantastic. So we're not with America anymore as being the only OECD country that didn't have statutory paid parental leave. That's important for lots of workers who don't have access to paid parental leave, of course. It's great that an increased range of flexibility in the workplaces has occurred, and it goes in cycles. So a few years ago, it was all about compressed working weeks, where people would work several long days, 3 or 4 long days, but have longer weekends, like a 3 or 4 day weekend, which I think sounds absolutely fantastic. That died down a bit, but it's good to see that practice, that compressed working week policy, is coming back into play. And again, it's employees with and without dependents who are requesting that, especially the compressed working week. Obviously, the increase in technology has made a huge impact to flexible working places policies. But we also know that can be a benefit and also a disadvantage. So how to effectively manage technology on a Saturday night when you should be with your children, but you're stuck answering emails from your boss is always an issue. And like Kevin said earlier, there's been an increased acknowledgement that the workplace culture is one of the key issues around the provision and the access and the support for flexible workplace policies to employees at all levels. So we've done quite a bit of work looking at changing organisational cultures for the positive. So it's not enough to say we have these provisions, we can tick that box, it's fine, but it's how much people can actually access these provisions in reality. If your supervisor or your colleagues are not supportive of this sort of access, then it really doesn't make much sense having that provision at all. If there's still a stigma associated with both men and women taking paid parental leave, for example, then having the policies in place is just lip service. So just quickly, a couple of areas where we've seen limited change, and which I think all of you working for innovative organisations could champion change a little bit more, perhaps. I still find it quite interesting, without sounding like a raging feminist, that organisational flexible work-life balance policies are still primarily accessed by women. So it's still about 70% women to 30% men who access flexible workplace practices, workplace policies. And I find that very confusing, and why that's still the case. It is growing in the number, but it's still way higher than it should be. There's also an issue, and this is a growing issue in Australia and in a number of other OECD countries, around pregnancy discrimination. So currently, Australia has pregnancy discrimination, a formal rate of around 11% per year. So those are the cases that make it through to the Sex Discrimination Act. Of course, lots of pregnancy discrimination, that's where you tell your boss you're pregnant, and suddenly your services are no longer required. And that can be obviously quite abrupt. A lot of those cases don't make it into the official figures, of course. And then there's the informal discrimination around that. So when you return to work after having a period of parental leave, the fact that your work roles are suddenly changed, are suddenly sidelined, are suddenly reduced to what they were. So there's the informal discrimination that still exists around taking flexible family policies. I find it shocking, and I keep telling my boss this, that women work on average approximately 10 hours more than men a week when you consider paid work, employment, and non-paid work, the work done in the home environment. That accounts to an extra month a year of more work done by women than men. And I know I risk being completely lynched by the panel and the male members of the audience, but again, that's on average. So the average woman and the average men. That's still far higher, that difference, than it should be. One area that hasn't changed is that employees who are unhappy with the provision of work-life balance policies that are currently available to them will use their feet, will leave their employers. That's we've seen time and time again. So for organisations looking to retain the skilled, knowledge-based workforce, it's becoming increasingly important to use those policies in terms of having them there, but also ensuring that workers have enough access to them to both attract and retain staff members. I hope all this is making sense. I'm trying not to sound too much like a academic lecturer. So final conclusions. In the work we've done, we've seen and we've worked with a number of organisations here and overseas that the employers of choice are those who are truly innovative in their use of work-life balance policies. And again, I emphasise the point of the culture there. So if your CEO, if your supervisor is supportive, but also practices what they preach, doesn't email you late at night or all over the weekend, so there's an expectation that you don't also have to do that. Those are the employers that are truly innovative and are truly the employers of choice, in my opinion. Finally, one of the issues that we're currently grappling with is the issue of diversity in organisations. And especially for those organisations which are male-dominated. So the issue of how do you increase diversity at the leadership level, but also at the rank and file level, is a growing concern and one we're doing quite a bit of work with at the moment. The issue, of course, is that the way some organisations are structured prohibit equality amongst the workforce. So organisations that have primarily rely on shift work or postings, involuntary postings all around the state, it's harder for women or for people with young families to take those postings, which could then, because they don't take them, which could then, I thought people were making a quick exit, which could then lead to a lack of promotion opportunities. So we've been doing some work, especially with some of the male-dominated organisations, to try and improve the level of diversity of their workforce, as I said, both at the rank and file level and at the senior level. I hope that made sense. I think I've taken 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Some lovely insights there, which I might reflect on when we wrap things up. Our last speaker, Dominic McGann. Dominic is the chairman of Partners of McCulloch Robertson, a leading law firm in Australia with 52 partners and close to 450 employees, located in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Newcastle. Dominic joined McCulloch Robertson in 1996. Prior to joining the firm, he held prominent positions with the Queensland Government for 7 years and is one of only a few lawyers with a combination of significant senior government experience as well as private practice experience. A recognised mining and resource expert with over 30 years' experience, an element of his practice is native title and cultural heritage matters, on which Dominic is an acknowledged authority. He's acted for various coal, base metals and other mining operations, petroleum and gas operators, water entity, electricity entities, port, state government agencies, foreign governments and a range of other entities as well. He's the chair of McCulloch Robertson Foundation, chair of the Brisbane Writers' Festival, a director of Flagship Investments Limited and a director of the Australian National Development Index and a director of the Fraser Family Foundation. He's also a Queensland Male Champion of Change, which is where I think we first met, and is personally and professionally committed to using his first influence and position of leadership to achieve change on gender equality issues in organisations and communities. Please welcome Dominic.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thank you also to the AEDCQ and Kevin and your team for the opportunity to speak tonight. By way of introduction, what I thought I'd do is to pick up a comment that Paula made about being in an ivory tower, and every morning, or most mornings, my sister sends me a text message because she walks around Kangaroo Point and comes past our building and says to me dismissively, "What are you doing in the ivory tower?" So I have to tell her. And I guess that's the starting point for some of the things that I have done in what she describes as the ivory tower. The first thing is, in relation, I just want to make 5 points tonight, but I do a lot of sub-points, but 5 big points. The first one, human rights. I think we need to draw a distinction between having rights as opposed to having to enforce those rights, as opposed to actually simply enjoying them. So in one sense, those of you, you're all familiar with the expression liberty, equality, fraternity. In terms of liberty, it is that everyone should have the opportunity to realise their potential. In terms of fraternity, it is that we are all workers in the vineyard and we all have an opportunity to contribute. And the third is, in terms of equality, I tend to say in the firm often that we should do unto others as we'd have them do unto ourselves. That is, everyone should be treated equally. So against that concept of how I view human rights, I would then say, well, what does it mean in the context of an employer of choice? That is, to make McCullough Robertson a great place to work. I have to quickly acknowledge that I'm naughty and that I send emails over the weekend often. And Lou, who I'll come back to shortly, just smiled and giggled when she said, oh yeah, you failed there, Dominic. But in terms of making McCullough Robertson a great place to work, what it is, and many of the other speakers who have come before me have said this, it's about a firm like McCullough's embracing diversity, actually, and diversity, whether that's gender, sexual preference, race, faith, mental health. That is, that we acknowledge diversity. That is one element of it. The second is to ensure that you don't just acknowledge diversity, you have to ensure inclusion. The third is you then have other particular things within a workplace, and we have policies in terms of ensuring that we're an employer of choice around domestic violence. And then in relation to flexibility, we try to enable flexible work programs to allow people to balance their various responsibilities. And we do that in a way which ensures that everybody understands their respective obligations, either to themselves, their clients, and to the firm more broadly. So in terms of being an employer of choice, we try to address many particular things that we think are very relevant in our modern society. The third thing I'd say is, though, it's great to have a lot of good ideas, but then you actually need to have 3 things. I think the first is that you need to have leadership, and to an extent, yes, as the chairman of the firm, I have a particular responsibility in that regard, but everybody in the firm has an obligation to lead these initiatives. The second is that you need to have structure to ensure that it is not just concept, that you're actually doing something. And in that regard, our firm is very fortunate to have Louise, who's in the audience tonight and who I indicated earlier had given me a fail mark, to ensure that you've got good structure. And I think we've been blessed at McCullough Robertson to have Louise with us, because she is, beyond however well motivated we are, she has ensured that there is in fact a structure there to make sure we give effect to what our good intentions are, or being well intentioned. The third thing is actually, you can have leadership and you can have a structure, but you genuinely need to ensure that you have a culture which embraces things. And that is a day-to-day exercise, and it is about ensuring that you constantly live up to the ideals that are expressed in being an employer of choice. So that'd be the third thing I'd say. The final 2 things that I'd say is that, as I've said before, I think that as a firm, what we are is very much driven by principle. We have particularly strong views about what we're trying to achieve. Ultimately, however, we will be judged by outcomes. That is, how did we conduct ourselves on particular occasions? And the third thing is that even when we have done well, or if we have failed, we need to be open-minded to further ideas and to change. And as we often say, this is not a competition between law firms or between employers. This is about people working with each other, such that all employees get to have employers of choice. The final thing that I'd say is just in terms of a recent experience that I had with one of the people in our firm who has had underlying mental health issues. Every 6 months, and then we do partner reviews, we do mid-year partner reviews, and then we do end-of-year partner reviews. And I was reviewing one of our partners yesterday, in fact, and the circumstances of this particular individual who is in this partners group came up, and from my own point of view, I said to my colleague that I'd like to acknowledge the approach that had been taken by this person, by the partner, because it demonstrated a commitment to what we're trying to achieve. And pleasingly, his response was he was surprised, and I guess it goes to what I hope is the cultural element of what we're trying to achieve, and he just assumed it was a given that we would have conducted ourselves the way that we had. I'll finish there because I think that's the bell that says the hour, and I have to hand you back to Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. And look, we've got a few minutes we're going to make for some questions, but I'm just going to reflect on a couple of things that people have said while you think about maybe a question to ask one of the panel. We heard Kevin say right at the beginning about being an employer of choice, about a place just being a great place to work. And I love the analogy that you've used with me before about, does your organisation look like the Queen Street Mall? In fact, I've recently put up a photo. I've got a great photo of people in the Queen Street Mall and just asked that of the place that I work at the moment, and it promoted a really interesting conversation. Tony spoke about the continuum of mental health in the human experience, and I think that's a really important point to almost normalise mental health as part of the human experience, and that I think was an important point. He also talked about the importance of opening up conversations in the workplace and creating the spaces to have those conversations. Paula spoke about the economic sense of flexibility in work practices, emails at the middle of the night. And Dominic, there's rules you can put on email to bounce them back, you know. And I think talking about flexibility, broadening it beyond those with just family responsibilities, which actually led to greater mental health benefits, and technology also being both a benefit and a disadvantage in the space, which I think is quite interesting. And Dominic, of course, opening up, really talking about human rights and having people having the opportunity to realise their potential and embracing diversity by acknowledging it. And I think that's a really important point, and being judged by outcomes. And I think the thread throughout all of this was the importance of leadership and the leadership that gets created in organisations. My own personal experience as a CEO of a couple of organisations, senior executive of others, have always worked in a flexible work arrangement throughout my whole life. And what I find is the importance of stories being told at leadership level, saying it's okay. I love going into an organisation saying, actually, it's Wednesday and it's 3:30 and I'm getting my son, who has a significant disability as well. So I'm open about that, and I enjoy telling the story, because you can just see the organisation take this big breath and go, oh, it's okay for him, so it's okay for us. And go, yeah, of course it is. But those stories take courage to tell. And I think that thread of leadership and being able to talk about what it is that you do, and particularly sometimes the males actually being able to talk about what they do, because the evidence was, and I forget the figure, Paula, but it's predominantly females that are taking the opportunities. But this is a whole of community issue, not just a female or a male issue. And so the importance of those stories and leadership and courage to tell those stories, I think, is a thread that I could see throughout our four speakers. So with that, I'll just open for a question to any member of the panel. We'll just have a few questions just to finish things off. Anybody? We don't have a microphone, so you'll need to maybe yell it out. It's good acoustics in this room. Christina?
Hi, I'm Christina from Diversity Careers. Congratulations, Dominic, on your citation again this year. But my question's for Tony. So the WGEA has been doing the citation and their reporting for a couple of years now. I'm wondering if there's a relationship between a reduction in the $11 million mental health cost over years since that's been in place, or have we not yet seen a financial payoff from that?
I certainly haven't seen any evidence of a financial payoff. I would say anecdotally that would be the case. The report was conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers. I don't think they've come back to review their assumptions or their analysis. I could be wrong about that. I think that even in the short time that that report has been out, we have made incredible inroads. People are far more aware of the issues and are doing something about it. And that's why I was focusing at the end on measurement, because unless we are able to measure how well we are doing things, what difference we're making, then we won't really be in a position to continue to advocate for the right sorts of measures.
Another question. Stunned silence. I've got a question about how do we actually promote that discussion amongst leaders, and it's an open question to the panel. How do we promote that issue of leaders telling the stories and promoting flexibility in the workplace and acknowledging that you obtain diversity and flexibility actually by talking about it? Anyone want to have a go? Kevin?
Yeah, you could put on your executive leadership team's agenda that they must every month come and tell about a story of how one of their staff members or how have been using flexible workplace or doing other things or being supported or you know, looking out for the health and well-being. So and maybe making it, you know, an annual process for all team leaders to talk about these stories, or, you know, and of course, you know, we need to be respectful of some of the privacy issues and some of the particulars, but I think we can promote that what we're doing, what's working, how, I think Tony's identified how we're measuring it, but also what's not working, because I think it's equally critical, because we might tick a couple of boxes just to assume we've crossed the finishing line and we haven't, and there's, you know, it might work for some people but it doesn't work for everyone.
Make a comment?
I would say that in our firm, because of how law firms are organised, I think people do look to see what the partners are doing. Are they saying one thing and doing another? So I'll use this example by reference to other partners. So if I used one of our young tax partners, he's always had an understanding that he wanted to work particular days of the week, so having flexible work arrangements, because he had particular responsibilities that he wanted to ensure he was able to pursue at home. Another partner, equally, these are both male partners, and that in itself, given some of the conversation that's been said so far, it's just a matter they have conversations with the executive, and the executive says, okay, fine, it's fine. It's just a matter, as I say, it's a conversation about managing an expectation of, well, what would you like to do? What you do need in our context, need to be able to say, well, how are the interests of the client going to be addressed, and what does the firm need to do? And one particular one, which was always, sadly, Darren's no longer with us, but he, at one stage, he put his career on hold, so that, and he's decided, okay, I'm going to stop being a partner, going away for 2 years, I'll stay in touch with the firm, and work out whether I come back to the firm in order to enable my wife to pursue her career. And so they went overseas. So realistically, what it is demonstrating either by doing it or by supporting that it's the norm. It's nothing unusual.
Tony, what are the management skills most lacking in the workplace when we consider the mental health issues that you've raised?
I think there are very difficult conversations to be had, and I think it's around communication. I guess the most important aspect of management or leadership is probably self-awareness. And with self-awareness, I think, comes a degree of confidence about how you can talk about those sorts of issues. So I think it stems from that. we do tend to have entrenched stereotypes and stigma attached to mental illness. So how are we going to start the conversation if we don't really appreciate the issues? In fact, we may have those misunderstandings ourselves. So that sense of self-awareness about being able to bring what we know of our family, our community, when we know the incidence of mental health issues within our community, we should bring that understanding into our workplace and start from there. That's a challenge, I think, for managers to take those steps to open up those conversations.
And one question, Paula, for you about technology. You raised the technology as both a plus and a minus. I mean, is there any evidence on the horizon that shows where it's a negative? I can see instances where it is a negative and where the expectation is it's 24/7 and the news cycle's 24/7 in some industries and everyone's online all the time.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the issue. So when we're looking at mental ill health, stress and depression in the workplace, a lot of that is caused, and we can track it, we can measure that by the fact that there's no downtime, there's no recovery time, or there's not sufficient amount of recovery time. So whether that's overnight or weekends or summer holidays, vacation breaks, we can see that people who are working long hours constantly or over a long period of time, it leads to burnout. So that's quite clear. The evidence is quite clear. So it's the appropriate management of technology that's the key after hours, I think.
All right. Well, would you please thank our panel? And, sorry, there was another question, was there? All right, we've got one last question. I'm just...
Tony, I was interested in the Reflect and Connect program. Just say a little bit about how that operates and what...
So the question was about the Reflect and Connect program.
Yes, well, it came down to some very talented people in our organisation who were able to put together that program. And it took us all away from our desk and from our work and firmly established our own sense of who we are as the centre of that day. As I said, there is a lot of change happening, particularly in mental health, and a lot of anxiety about job security and a whole lot of things like that. So to be able to have those discussions openly was really important to how the organisation was going to address the change and the anxiety. So it was an invitation, I guess, firstly around trust and the confidence to talk about the issues. So that was the talent of the way in which the day evolved and how that was established, that level of trust. And then to ask people to contribute what is in their burning ambition. What is it that's important to each of us that we want to give expression to in the organisation, and how can we align that with the values and directions of the organisation? So bringing together and a letting go of some anxiety. It was a very powerful experience for many people who were able to symbolically throw away the thing at the end of the day that most bothered them and take on a new understanding of the future.
Thanks, Tony. I've got one last task, which is to draw a business card out of the hat for a winner. I'm not going to take the top one. This one will do. Look at this. It's a piece of paper. And what do they win, Michaela?
Well, the lovely Simone from JobShare has offered one of her services. There's a list of them out of the front desk, but whoever the lucky person is that wins, we will match you up with Simone, who's now actually promoting through sessions.
So the winner for that lovely prize is Karen Buchholz. Buchholz? There you are, Karen over there. Well done, Karen. To wrap things up for this evening, it's my pleasure to thank Dominic, Paula, Tony and Kevin. Invite you to stay for some refreshments and networking, and thank you again for coming out on a brief, stormy Brisbane evening to hear such an interesting panel session. Thanks very much for joining us.